And through that, in 2012, after 2 years in the clinic, we made this huge discovery in soil science, where we were able to identify these carbon molecules within the soil that are made by bacteria that would have the potential for communication across cell systems. And that was the first, we became the first science group to really say bacteria can produce a communication network that could potentially really massively impact the human body and perhaps the human experience itself.
Namaste. You're listening to the Sivana Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SivanaSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Sivana Podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who've joined our private Facebook group at Sivana East on Facebook and given us your feedback about the show. We love connecting with you and, of course, getting your reviews. So please leave a review here on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. I'm super excited for today's chat with Dr. Zach Bush. He's one of the few triple board certified physicians in the country with expertise in internal medicine, endocrinology, metabolism, and hospice palliative care. Today with him, we're going to be learning about actionable steps to reconnect with Mother Nature and reach a higher consciousness, and more specifically, the relationship between bacteria and human consciousness. So it's going to get really interesting. Zach, thanks so much for being with us today.
Brett, a pleasure to be on. I really appreciate the invitation.
Wonderful. So I think listeners would love to learn just a little bit more about you and your background before we dive into some of the really juicy scientific spiritual combo concepts we're going to talk about today. So can you tell us about you and how you got started in medicine and then passionate about this in particular?
Sure. It was a nonlinear process like all of life. All of life, I think, travels in spirals rather than lines. And so my career was very much a wandering search for truth. Dove in to academia thinking I was going to be an engineer, and then took a year off from before college and went to the Philippines to do some missions work with a international group of midwives and had the opportunity to birth babies over in the Philippines, and had an extraordinary experience there that really redirected me from the physics and math kind of world into biology and pursuit of a career in medicine. And then once I got into medicine, I found myself continuously running out of good information. And I really went in with a really strong intention to improve human health and to really impact humanity positively. But in allopathic Western medicine, we end up being given an intense education in pharmaceutical and technological interventions into human biology that rarely come without really negative side effects. And so increasing frustration of not being able to really understand truth at the biology level, increasing frustration that I didn't have tools in my toolbox to deliver health, I kept getting more and more education. And so that's how I ended up triple board certified. And I was doing endocrinology and metabolism research, which is kind of the control of the whole body of how hormones talk across large systems to create communication networks and all of this. And so that's what I was studying in the lab. I was doing research in cancer and around the hormonal manipulation of cancer, as well as in the clinics treating diabetes and autoimmune disease and the like. So very broad spectrum even in my allopathic medical training. And I started to really get disillusioned towards the end of that 17 years of training and 9 years of practice in medicine. I was starting to get really frustrated that, no matter how high I climbed on this academic ladder, I seemed to be getting no clear messages that were going to work for my patients. And they were getting increasingly frustrated because I'd been their doctor for 9 years, and I could make them look perfect on paper. Their cholesterol looked perfect. Their blood sugars looked good. They were getting worse and worse and worse. And there was a sudden realization that my tools were treating symptoms or downstream numbers on a lab sheet rather than the people themselves. And so that's when I finally developed my third subspecialty, which was hospice and palliative care, because that was the one part where I could really point to as a doctor that this is always a rewarding moment to be a part of a human's life at this second birth of when we transition through what we call death here. It's really this incredible, transformative, energetic moment. And I was drawn to that. I loved it. I didn't understand it. I wasn't even in doing hospice and palliative care. There's such little understanding of what we're witnessing, but there's an innate human aspect of us that I think is drawn to the intensity and the beauty of that transformation. So that led to my third subspecialty in hospice and palliative care. And in the midst of all of that, the huge collapse of our economy happened in 2009-10, and that left the NIH, through which all my research was funded, bereft of funding. And so we lost our funding at the University of Virginia for our General Clinical Research Center. And that's ultimately how I lost my funding for my research. And so I found myself suddenly at the end of this 17-year climb towards becoming, this huge academic leader in cancer and research and all this stuff, to unfunded lab. And I just knew at a core level that I could spend the rest of my career chasing rabbit holes in academia and really not find something meaningful. So I was quite depressed, and we were talking about this relationship to consciousness, and I can tell you at this point in my life, I had reached a very low point of understanding my purpose here on earth, and why was I brought into this body, and why did I go, a house mortgage worth of school debt to go through all this training and then end up with nothing. I was unfunded, nobody seemed to be supportive. I had no community around me. I was lonely. And so it was very much at a low point. And then, through crying out to the universe in 2010, in a single day, I was given a huge gift. And I didn't even have the language that you guys listening all speak to every day. You guys are all very aware of words like intention and downloads and all of this stuff that I've learned over these last 8 years of my life, but I had none of that. And so this huge vision download came to me in 2010, and I was scribbling on pieces of scratch paper as all this information came through. And I had this overwhelming plugged in experience of this is my purpose somehow. And it was just this sunlight in the midst of what had been a really dismal months and years.
So up to this point in 2010, you didn't have a spiritual practice or a meditation practice, or you were dabbling, or you just felt like there was something missing?
Yeah, I was raised in a Christian home in Boulder, Colorado, to a couple of hippie parents. And so I had an experience a couple times in my life, a real palpable experience with divinity and God, and all through the kind of Christ perspective that I had been raised in this kind of non-denominational hippie church. And so I would have, if you had asked me then, I would say, yeah, I have very strong faith. I have an extremely strong faith. I studied scripture all growing up. I was very intensely involved in our church, and I know, the Judeo-Christian Bible backwards and forwards, and I know all this stuff. And so I would have told you at the time that, I know I have a rich faith, but what I wasn't getting in hindsight was a rich experience of spirituality on a daily basis. I was disconnected from that deeper thing. Even though I had a lot of cognitive understanding and knowledge and belief and faith, I was not experiencing a deep spiritual connectivity, which is what happened in that moment, and had happened a few times before where I'd gotten glimpses of that.
So it sounds like you hit sort of a low point professionally and maybe a little bit financially as well. And then there was what you're calling this download, this Epiphany Moment. Do you want to tell listeners a little bit more detail about what happened there or what was involved with that?
It would take quite a while to explain that whole thing. In a nutshell, suddenly it was a system of clinics that were functioning more as educational centers than healthcare centers. And these clinics were being paralleled by knowledge development centers. And it was just basically a vision for how, in a local fashion, we could start to replace or reinvent academia and the intellectual pursuits, as well as the delivery of that information to the individual to foster health at a really foundational level, both physical as well as perhaps spiritual as well. And so it was a complex series of companies and entities that would all be working kind of in synergy together to bring about a different way in which for us as humans to cooperatively create knowledge and cooperatively communicate our own passions and purpose to one another.
And at a certain point in this journey, you got even more focused, or especially particularly interested in the microbiome, bacteria, and the health of our gut. Is that correct?
That's a very appropriate fast forward. But yeah, so the fast forward then is, in that collapse, I realized that, going after another job at some other university was not going to really change my trajectory. And really all I had left was to go and kind of try to pursue this big vision that had come some months earlier. And I had never started a company. I didn't know how to run businesses. And so during a Bible study that I was leading, actually, I just covered some scriptures on Ecclesiastes, which is one of my favorite books, and just wrapped that one up. And it was all about kind of letting go and trusting and all of this. And then at the end, I just asked for some prayer from the group that, I don't know how to start a company. I think I'm being led to start a company. I don't know how to do that. It's a call for resources kind of thing. And this little neurology resident, sweet little short gal, came up to me kind of shyly at the end and said, well, my dad's in town and he, I think, helps companies get started. Would you like to talk to him? And that guy ended up listening for 4 hours while I explained all these Venn diagrams and this download and everything else. He patiently just listened to this whole thing. And then at the end of it, he said, well, that's a really, really huge thing, obviously, and I don't think you're prepared to do any of that. But what I think you could do is come down to this very bottom corner of your diagram here and start this one little circle that I think you told me was going to be a clinic. And I said, yeah, that is a clinic. He said, well, ignore all of the rest of the download and just focus on that one circle right there for the next years. And if that starts to work and you learn what you need to do there, I have a feeling all the rest of this will become possible over the rest of your lifetime. And I kind of had the same thought of like, this huge download, this huge vision. I think that's all going to take the next 50 years to unfold. And now 7 years later, the vast majority of it's all sitting right in front of me for real now. And so it's been this huge rapid acceleration, and it all happened because I decided to follow his instructions and start that little circle, which was a nutrition center. And so I went down to Scottsville, Virginia, which is a rural town of 550 people, and it abuts the poorest county in our area, Buckingham, Virginia. And Buckingham is not only poor, it's a huge food desert. And so there's really not even really a grocery store that within half-hour drive for most of those people. And so a lot of people are eating daily out of a Sheetz gas station as their main kind of food supply. And so in that environment, I started this nutrition clinic with the intention of teaching people how to eat a vegan, plant-based lifestyle, which is completely opposite of the typical diet you're seeing in these food deserts. And so my colleagues who watched me do this all assumed I'd kind of tipped off the deep end and it was insane. They said I should go to Santa Barbara and start a vegan clinic there or something like that. And I told them I just was not terribly interested in improving the health of Santa Barbara, and that if we weren't really going to find a solution that was going to work in rural America, it wasn't probably going to have enough of an impact to give purpose. So I went down and we started that process, and over the next couple of years, we had this extraordinary experience of finding out that these kind of fifth generation poverty families were actually the most motivated and were the most able to carry through with our instructions to start growing their own food again and start really reconnecting with nature. And so we had an incredible experience of seeing humans really turn back on and take responsibility and freedom and independence in their own kind of reconnect with food development and nature. And in that midst, we started to realize that there was a lot of those people that were starting to eat health food that we're healing so quick. We're having amazing reversal of diabetes, and cancer was remitting. We had all kinds of miracles happening on a daily basis, but there was at least 30 to 40% of these people that were really working to eat health food, and they were actually getting worse, not better. And so after 2 years of watching this population of our clinic, that 30 or 40%, that no matter how good we tried to feed them, their bodies were actually deteriorating faster, more inflammation, more bloating, more discomfort, more brain fog, more achiness. And it was in studying that group that we started to ask really complicated questions, or perhaps simple questions in the end, about food integrity and the soil that the food was growing in, and then ultimately the bacteria's role in all of that. And through that, in 2012, after 2 years in the clinic, we made this huge discovery in soil science, where we were able to identify these carbon molecules within the soil that are made by bacteria that would have the potential for communication across cell systems. And that was the first, we became the first science group to really say bacteria can produce a communication network that could potentially really massively impact the human body and perhaps the human experience itself.
Tell listeners a little bit, just in case they're not familiar, about the role good and bad bacteria plays in the body, and then how that interplays now with what I think you're talking about, which is the bacteria that's actually in the soil where we farm and grow our food.
Excellent. So increasingly, I was taught all about good and bad bacteria, and we have all these antibiotics to kill bad bacteria and all this, always knowing that when we put an antibiotic in the system, we kill a lot of good bacteria. And so that we have this in Western medicine, and I think in the lay public, we have this huge view of there's good bacteria and there's bad bacteria. But you fast forward through what we've learned in the last 7 years, and I'm suddenly in a place where I don't believe there is such a thing as bad bacteria anymore. All there can be is a lack of balance. And so if you have a balanced ecosystem, you'll have somewhere around 40,000 species of bacteria in the soil or in your intestines. And they are different bacterial populations that will live in the soil versus that in your gut, as far as which ones are the dominant strains, but they all contribute to it. And so we want to have soil bacteria being breathed into our lungs and breathed and ultimately delivered through our sinuses to our gut lining and everything else. They may not set up long-term shop there, they may pass through, but they play this important role. And so soil outside of our body, the soil of our organic guts, the air around a waterfall and the moss and everything else that you'd see in an environment like that, or the sand at the beach, all of those are going to have much different bacterial populations, and they all come together to create this incredible diversity. So in an ideal situation, the human body would be teeming with somewhere around 40,000, maybe upwards of 100,000 species of bacteria. Fungi is a whole different category. The fungi, we're looking at more like 5 million species of fungi out there in the environment and interacting with our bodies. And so instead of thinking about good and bad bacteria, we should think about good and bad balance within that ecosystem. And if we suddenly get hit with a big viral infection or an antibiotic or chemotherapy, we'll get a huge imbalance suddenly develop. And then the weed-like bacteria that are trying to help recover that damaged ecosystem will crop up. And then we call those bad bacteria. But in fact, those bacteria, or oftentimes a yeast, like Candida is a common one. You take an antibiotic for your urinary tract infection, suddenly you got thrush in your mouth and you've got a yeast overgrowth. And then we say, well, that bad yeast or whatever. Well, it's not bad yeast at all. That yeast has been there in your gut all along. When you wiped out all the bacteria with an antibiotic, the yeast was the thing that had to move in first to try to reconstitute some sort of environment of metabolism and cellular breakdown and all of this digestive process. And so I think the yeast or the parasite or all these things that we say are bad, they're all playing an important role in the ecosystem, and they just show up in a dominant fashion when the ecosystem has been largely damaged.
This podcast was brought to you by SivanaSpirit.com. In ancient Indian mythology, and even today, chakras are considered to be the most important energy centers in the body. It's been said that when all 7 energy points are aligned, deep spiritual development occurs. When the chakras come into balance, they bring harmony, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. In fact, sometimes when we feel off, it's really just these energy points that need to be worked on. Celebrate the 7 chakras with a beautiful must-have chakra tank. Printed down the spine with sophisticated metallic ink, the chakras are represented by unique hand-drawn symbols. You can add a pop to your style with elegance, all while reminding yourself of the deeper spiritual truth of our world. Use the exclusive discount code PODCAST30 for 30% off your first order today. Do you want a $25 gift card from SivanaSpirit.com completely for free? It's super easy. All you have to do is fill out a quick survey with 7 short questions, and then you'll be emailed your gift card to use whenever you're ready. This survey will help us better understand the most important thing in the world, you. Go to SivanaSpirit.com/podcast survey today and claim your reward. Again, that's SivanaSpirit.com/podcast survey. And so the folks that were in the clinic that weren't getting better, I want to come back to them. Why was that happening? Why were you seeing some folks really excel and others seem to be getting worse?
That took us about 4 or 5 years to really tease out for sure. So let me give you the short answer of that. The short answer is that those 30 to 40% that were really declining, despite the healthiest food on the planet, their membranes were leaking. Their gut membrane in particular was not managing the material that they were putting in their mouth appropriately. And what I mean by that is what should be this really coherent protective layer of the gut lining was leaking, and they could eat something like kale, which has incredible superfood capacity, but it also has a ton of insoluble fiber in it. And I see this happen all the time where somebody says, well, I tried going on a vegan diet and I was so bloated and I was just constipated and I was just so miserable. Well, that's largely because they suddenly were eating 2 pounds of kale a day, because that's this ubiquitous fad-like green that's on the market now. And so they were eating these huge kale salads for the first time in their life. And all of that insoluble fiber in the kale, if the gut lining is leaking, is suddenly going to be introduced to the immune system, and the immune system has to react, and that's going to lead to more inflammation over time. And so what we've now found is that if you yourself or people you know have tried to make healthy dietary changes and felt, in fact, worse, not better, 9 times out of 10, they've identified themselves in that moment as having a permeable or leaky intestinal membrane, and they are overwhelming their immune system by whatever they put in. And what they tend to tolerate best is their 2 or 3 favorite foods that they've been eating for decades, and they've developed the bacterial narrow population to help deal with those, and that way not much is getting across that leaky gut membrane. But if you suddenly introduce a new food to somebody with a leaky gut, they're going to get a very rapid overwhelm of the immune system.
It's like that gut lining or intestinal tract for them is just broken. It's not able to properly absorb or take in the healthy food and break it down. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this spurred you creating a product around this idea. Is that true?
Yeah. So once we found those molecules in the soil, it kind of closed the loop, because when we realized that there's a communication network between the bacteria, it helped close the loop on a lot of questions that had been coming into the Western medicine world in my cancer research, which was showing that if you have these bacteria in your gut or these bacteria, then you get breast cancer. If you have these bacteria or you're missing these bacteria, you'll get colon cancer. And so we had, in 2000 and 2010, been able to show that there was a direct correlation between which bacteria were dominant in your gut and which cancers you might get. That was crazy talk to our understanding of how cancer occurred and everything else, that bacteria could somehow predict or predispose somebody to a specific type of cancer. But when we found these molecules, suddenly we kind of had an answer to the mechanism by which that might happen, is that the bacteria in your gut are making this huge communication network. And if you're missing parts of that vocabulary, you may be very vulnerable to cancer in such and such an organ or such and such an organ. And so we suddenly, with the discovery of this language or communication network of the bacteria, started to have a framework to understand our relationship to the bacterial biome and the fungal biome and this huge micro ecosystem in our gut and in our greater environment around us.
This is huge. I mean, I'm like, how do more people not know about this? And I think, my next question, and I'm sure on listeners' minds as well, is what can we do in our day-to-day life with either what we're eating or supplements we're taking to try to have the healthiest possible balance and ecosystem, as you're saying, in our gut to keep us healthy and safe?
To answer that question, I'm going to give you an idea of what the environment looks like that we're living in right now. It's changed dramatically over the last 40 years. And that's why we've seen this exponential epidemic of a chronic disease in this country. In 1960s, we had 4% of our population with a chronic disease. Now in 2015, just 2 years ago with our most recent numbers, not only the whole population, but even if you just look at the children, 46% of the children in the United States are carrying a diagnosis of a chronic disease. So 4% of the entire population in 1960, now 46% of our children affected by chronic disease before the age of 12. So that burden of disease has correlated with this massive change in the ecosystem. And that change in the ecosystem started with our farming practices that shifted following World War II. World War II saw this huge upregulation of our petroleum industry. It was the first war that's been mechanized to the degree that it was. We had planes, tanks, jeeps, massive ships all over the world moving. And so the whole European front, and then we had the Asian front, and we literally were fighting basically 2 world wars simultaneously. The amount of fuel we were burning through as a nation had never been seen in human history before. And so we had this massive industrial machine revved up to deliver petroleum. Then the war ends, and suddenly there's this massive glut of potential. And so we took that petroleum as kind of a raw material that no longer had a market, and we turned it into a farming market. And we took that fuel and extracted nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and created NPK fertilizer. NPK fertilizers became the foundation of what would move on to be called the green revolution of the 1950s and 60s. We started dumping all of this NPK petroleum-based fertilizers into soil, and we got this boom of crop development because nitrogen makes green plants. but it does not mean that the plant is carrying nutrient. And so we were suddenly growing all these fast-growing green plants in this petroleum-based fertilizer environment, and it was a boon. We suddenly turned the Midwest from Dust Bowl, almost dead, in the 1930s. The Dust Bowl was right during the Depression and all the starvation that was happening in our country. We were literally starving to death as a country in the 1930s. And then you fast forward to the 1950s, and we had become titled the breadbasket of the world. We were growing more food in the Midwest than we needed as a nation. We were exporting to the whole world because we were so abundant. And we were doing that through spraying NPK fertilizers. Well, what we didn't realize is that by disrespecting the complexity and beauty of composting and soil and the bacteria and this biome in the soil, we were growing dead food. We were growing food that was suddenly, for the first time in human history, devoid of the nutrients that would make for a healthy, vibrant plant. Well, plants, just like humans, when our nutrition starts to fail, we become weak in the immune system. And so what was happening is the plants were suddenly getting overwhelmed by weeds and parasites and viruses and fungi and all of these pests. And so we then turned right back to the same chemical companies that were giving us the fertilizers and said, well, we have pests. And they said, no problem, we'll make you herbicides and pesticides. And so suddenly, not only was our fertilizer chemical, we were treating the plants throughout their life cycle with weed killers around and the pesticides that were being sprayed on and everything else to help bolster up or band-aid up these weakened immune system plants. Through those next decades, your soil that you were born into, so most of you listening are probably between the ages of 25 and 50, you guys were really one of the first generations, and I'm right in that generation with you. Our generation was the first to be born into this dead soil environment. Our parents, I think, still had some nutrient density. But for our generation, where we're seeing this huge glut of disease, is really being correlated perfectly in time with this loss of nutrition of the soil, the loss of the microbiome. So now you ask the question, well, how do we as this generation start to really pursue a healthy, balanced microbiome? And the answer is going to be we have to re-engineer or reverse engineer our environment back to probably where we were in the 1940s. And the way to do that is in your backyard. An extraordinary statistic of the World War II era is that because of the starvation that we had in our country moving into the war with the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, which, by the way, the Dust Bowl occurred because we weren't crop rotating, we weren't taking care of the topsoil. All the topsoil died, turned into dust, and was blowing around the country, burying people's homes. And so it was through disrespect to the soil that we developed this starvation. And then coming out of that starvation, we were moving into the World War II area, and we had to suddenly feed troops all over the world. So we had this huge paucity of food, and we needed to get it mobilized to where our troops were. And so the solution was a movement called the Victory Gardens. And so the British, all the Allied Forces countries, and the U.S. Started growing Victory Gardens in our backyard. So all the U.S. citizens were called to grow food in your backyard, and whatever you're not eating, can it and send it to the troops. And so what we saw by the end of World War II is that Americans were growing 45% of the entire food chain in their backyard. That was a huge reversal to kind of hundreds of years before. We had already kind of outsourced a lot of our food production by the 40s. So we were taking that back into our own home, taking responsibility for our own food chain, such that single families were not only feeding themselves, they were also feeding others. And so 45% at the end of World War II, and now you fast forward today, we're growing less than 1,000% of our food in our backyards. And so we have massively outsourced our farming and food production to other people. Even if you're eating organically, my guess is many of your meals are coming from a pre-prepared line at Whole Foods, or your healthiest option green smoothie place down the street, or whatever it is. And so even when we're eating healthy today, it's unusual that we're actually the ones preparing that. Extremely unusual that we're actually growing and picking the food and turning that into a green drink or a beautiful meal or salad on our kitchen table. So we are so responsible for, and we are so the cause of, factory farming by our convenience lifestyles.
I think what you're saying is so true in terms of us just outsourcing. We just expect to buy our food in stores, and a lot of times in plastic bags. One thing that's running through my mind is I interviewed a couple weeks ago Brigitte Mars. She's an herbalist, and one of the things that we talked about, because it was very similar, right? It was like, we need to start reclaiming ownership of our food. We need to start growing food in our backyard. But one of the things that she brought up is that you need to get your neighbors involved too, because the soil might might not be safe or appropriate? Or can you speak to that a little bit for people who are like, oh, okay, I'd be willing to maybe start a garden or take some action steps here, but is it even worth it? Is it even possible if the soil around me or the soil has this imbalance that we're talking about already?
Very good. The good news is Mother Nature is brilliant at fixing problems. Mother Nature has so many solutions up her sleeve to our biggest mistakes. And when we start to think about soil quality in our environment, it comes down to really one molecule as far as I'm concerned. This is a compound called glyphosate. And glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. Glyphosate hit the market in 1976. It was actually discovered in 1957 by a Japanese researcher who immediately put it on a shelf and did not want to get that out into the world because he recognized that he had created a water-soluble toxin that killed bacteria in plants. Being water soluble meant that it would be very hard to contain if that got out into the environment. It would go into the air that we breathe. It would go into the rainfall. It would get everywhere. So it sat on a shelf from 57 to 1976. And then Monsanto, company you've probably never heard of, Monsanto comes along, buys up that patent, and they repatent it as an antibiotic. And it kills bacteria. Subsequently, they've also put patents in as an antifungal and an anti-parasite, and it kills just about every bug or plant it touches. And so that compound got put into limited use in the 1970s and 80s, and we had to use it as a spot weed killer. You'll remember the Super Bowl commercials maybe with these guys walking out of their garages to a dramatic soundtrack with a backpack of Roundup and these pistol grip sprayers, and they'd spray down these 10 dandelions or 3 dandelions in their driveway. Of course, dandelions are a superfood against cancer, but that aside, they're spraying this chemical and then they show this fast forward of the plant dying over the next 24 hours. And the message is this guy never has to bend over to weed again. He can just walk around with these pistol sprayers looking cool and kill all the weeds. And that was a very successful campaign. And suddenly every suburban home had a thing of Roundup and they were spraying it down their driveways, washing into our municipal water systems. And so unbeknownst to ourselves, we started drinking Roundup, this water-soluble toxin that was going to stay in the water system by the 1980s. By the 1992, Monsanto discovered that they could market it as a desiccant or a drying agent for wheat crops. Wheat's the only crop that you want to kill before you harvest it. And so usually you have to sit there and watch it grow to maturity, go to seed, and then dry out and die before you harvest it. And Monsanto came along to all these northern climate farmers who were always at risk of an early snowfall or early precipitation that would get that mature wheat wet, and it'd stay wet, and they wouldn't be able to harvest it, and they'd lose a crop. So Monsanto came in and said, hey, look, this is a desiccant. You can spray your entire wheat field and it will die in 3 days and you can harvest it early. Well, that's a boon. But of course, that also started to get abused where suddenly people slightly further south could spray their crop early, harvest it, and get a second crop into the ground, and suddenly they were growing 2 seasons of wheat in a single season. And so it started to really be abused, I think, and overutilized. And suddenly we were delivering wheat to the consumer through flour and through baked goods and everything else that was laced with this glyphosate directly. No longer being used as a weed killer and washing into our water system, is now being directly applied to our food. 1996 rolls around and Monsanto creates the genetically modified Roundup Ready soybean, Roundup Ready corn that could be directly sprayed. And so by the end of the 90s and early 2000s, we were spraying the vast majority of our corn, soybean, and wheat, our 3 main staple crops that make the vast majority of our food chain, were being directly sprayed with this chemical. And so here we are saying you need to get outside and you need to get growing food. You got to be aware that glyphosate molecule has now gotten everywhere. It's become a ubiquitous chemical in our environment. 75% of the air and 75% of the rainfall recently measured throughout the southern United States is contaminated with glyphosate. And so if your backyard is quote unquote organic, you're not spraying anything, you do need to be aware that there probably is still chemical there. The solution to all of that in the long run is going to be, let's restore the soil. I think over the next couple of generations, if we really start to teach soil management, teach soil responsibility of composting, crop rotation, all of these things, and really permaculture type practice where you're growing 15 or 20 species of veggies in the same area instead of 1 or 2. These things will really rejuvenate our soils to the point where they're passing on antidotes to this chemical glyphosate. But in the short run, what we've shown is that if we go back in time to the healthy soils of 50 million years ago, we can extract all that information. And that's what's in the dietary supplement that we produce and everything else is let's take all of that rich potential of bacterial intelligence and put it into the soil. And what we see is that has a very profound effect on growing sprouts and things like that. So your seeds will grow faster, you can sprout quicker, the seeds will sprout quicker and they'll grow quicker, there'll be higher nutrient density in those foods. But what we see in the human is the same thing, where you suddenly correct the soil of the intestines very quick, overnight, really. And there's no bacteria in the supplement. It's only the communication network of the bacteria. But the result is that as soon as the communication exists, you're going to start to restore all that ecosystem complexity that you would want in your garden is going to happen right in your gut. And the root system of your intestinal lining that's sending out all these little tiny microscopic projections out into your food and the nutrient pool of the bacteria and everything else, those roots are suddenly going to be empowered to suck up the nutrients and get your body back running again.
So what I think I heard you say, definitely correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of the soil in our backyard, yes, it may not be perfect because of the world and the environment we live in this modern day and age. However, it's still better, much, much better than perhaps something would get in a store, especially if we're shopping at, not an organic supermarket for our produce. And then the second thing I think I heard you say is that there's actually a supplement that you've developed around all of this science. And I definitely want you to tell us more about that and how it works.
You're exactly right. And so if we grow in the backyard, we have a huge amount of control that we lack when we go to a grocery store. And so what you can be convinced of in your own backyard is you're not contributing to the problem by growing corn or any other crop, your tomatoes, your basils, all that stuff in the back. You got your peppers and your squash, all of that going in the backyard. You're going to have trace amounts of Roundup there for sure, but that trace amount is far less harmful than the amount that you would get on a piece of food that was sprayed just days before harvesting with that Roundup chemical. And so you're really reducing the toxicity by going out to the backyard. And after a couple seasons, you're going to watch your own plants start thriving. When I first planted my garden, I had just built my house, and a lot of the soil that had been dug out to build the house was spread out across what would become my garden. So it was just like dead red Virginia clay, and it wasn't growing anything. But after now 7 years of composting and just throwing more and more stuff and letting the incredible wildlife, the worms and the bacteria and everything else and the fungi growing into that dead soil, suddenly now, tomatoes just crop up spontaneously now all over my property because they went to seed 4 years ago or last year, and now that seed is coming into its own moment. So I've got this joy of I've got 12 tomato plants that are not even in my garden. They're kind of growing up around the paths and everything else as they self-seeded themselves over the years. And so the soil has rejuvenated itself very quickly. And the more you love on that soil and the more attention you give it, and the attention doesn't have to be intensive. If you go out and just dig up an area, or even just mowing can help. You're adding all this nitrogen as the grass goes into a compost state on top and everything else. So there's so many ways that through just your general maintenance of your yard, you can improve the soil there. So don't be dismayed. See it as an opportunity to re-engage. Know that Mother Earth is waiting to participate in the healing process that you're looking for.
Amazing. And now tell us more about the supplement that you've developed, because I definitely want to hear more about that and how it works.
So the supplement is developed from these carbon molecules that are made by the bacteria, and we knew we were going to need a rich variety of source for that. And so going to modern topsoil that's been indirectly or directly treated with an antibiotic like glyphosate and Roundup was going to be a poor choice. And so we went back in the fossil record. If you go about 8 feet deep in the southwest United States in the desert there, you'll find layers of fossil soil that are 50, 60 million years old. In that soil record, you can see that the topsoil layers used to be far deeper than they are today. And that's an exciting reality, that we had an ecosystem on this planet that grew plants, ferns that were the size of houses and stuff. So we had this huge abundance of nutrition in the soils that grow huge plants that were so nutrient dense that an herbivore, a plant-eating dinosaur, could grow to the size of 4 or 5 times the size of our largest elephants today. So these huge animals were surviving on plant life that was incredibly dense in nutrient because it was growing in soil that was incredibly rich in biodiversity. And so it's a pretty goosebumpy moment when I was the first person to start taking this into my body, and I was taking it orally and I was doing it intravenously. I was out of control, kind of trying to figure out what the biology of this stuff was. And in that process of kind of, experiencing this stuff in my own body, then subsequently giving it to many, many patients over the years, you get to see this goosebump moment of realizing this human body is now suddenly receiving information from an unfathomably deep microbiome of 50 million years ago. And this human is now experiencing this level of intelligence at the cellular level that's literally never been seen in human experience on this planet. The humans came well after that 50 million year mark. And so a fascinating reality that we can tap into this fossil record of intelligence, the microbiome, and we just get to see magic happen over and over again. So we have our own basic science laboratories, and we grow cells all the time, kidney cells, intestinal lining, all kinds of different cell types. And as soon as you put this bacterial communication into play, those cells start behaving differently than any of us as scientists have ever seen before. Is redefining the way that we understand human biology, because human biology has always been studied in a sterile petri dish. Our entire understanding of cardiovascular physiology, cardiovascular disease, our entire understanding of cancer and how it occurs, all of that has been perfected knowledge in the context of a sterile petri dish. And so as soon as we added in this incredibly rich outside world of communication from the bacteria, every single element of that human biology shifted and changed under the microscope. And we're just at the very tip of scratching the surface of really redefining what human biology looks like in the context of a healthy biome.
There's nothing more essential to a gemstone collection than rose quartz, and SivanaSpirit.com has a beautiful selection you'll absolutely love. Use the code PODCAST30 at checkout for 30% off, and we promise you and your heart will be thankful. I'm going to be putting the link below for our listeners to the websites that you sent me. I know one is about composting and the other is about this supplement, this product Restore, so they can check that out. I want to touch on, before we let you go, human consciousness as our big finale. But before we do that, I feel like we've been talking a lot about food and diet, and I would love to know what your personal diet is. What are you eating? Are you vegan? And I know you're also a father and really super passionate about all this change because of your kids. What are you feeding your kids and your family? And what's kind of like your routine look like in terms of, you wake up and what do you drink and what do you eat?
In a nutshell, you eat low on the food chain. And so I started a clinic, and initially we called it vegan. Now we just call it plant-based. And so you're trying to eat the vast majority of your calories and nutrients from low on the food chain, which means you're eating a ton of plant life. And so you're eating tons of vegetables, a lot of fruit, the more complexity you can get into the variety there, the better you're going to do. So eat low on the food chain. If you're going to eat animal flesh or animal products, you're going to eat low on the food chain again. And so I'm a big fan of getting away from pork and poultry and beef, because that's very high on the food chain. The higher you eat on the food chain in a toxic world, the more toxin is going to be consolidated in that food. A good example of this is the fish kingdom. And so if you look at the fish on the supermarket, the most toxic ones that are going to be on the shelf are your really big fish, like your salmon and your tuna. Try not to eat salmon and tuna. Those are bad choices as far as the amount of toxin in there, the amount of plastics, mercury, all the herbicides, pesticides, antibiotic. All of those are going to show up in your ocean caught fish or stream caught fish. It just doesn't really matter anymore. We've so contaminated the planet that those big fish are going to be toxic. And in contrast, if you now go to a small white flesh fish instead of the dark flesh big fish, a white fish like stream caught trout or perhaps halibut or a cod, these smaller white flesh fish are going to have a lot less toxin in them. And so in general, if you can try to eat low on the food chain, you're going to get less toxin in your body. You're also going to have the opportunity to eat much more broadly. As far as spectrum of food. If you just have beef as your primary food, what you're really eating is corn and soybean that's been fed to that cow. Whereas if you eat a vegetable-based thing and you go ahead and try to match the same calories you had in that piece of beef with veggies, now you're going to have beets and turnips and potatoes and all your greens, and you've got a bunch of color in there with your radishes and peppers, and the nutrient quality of a colorful plate compared to a brown piece of grilled meat is night and day.
And what about for listeners who are saying, well, I buy organic grass-fed beef. Is that like okay? Or are you still saying no? Like lower on the food chain is always going to be better?
Always better. And again, no matter how healthy you think that cow may have been, it's still a brown piece of meat. It's the color of the reds and the greens and the purples and the tans and everything else that's in the planking. That's where the nutrients are. You can get lots of calories from fat and protein in your hamburger, but your nutrient quality, the amount of manganese and selenium and all these trace minerals that you need, as well as some of the complex carbohydrates and fibers and everything else, none of that exists in the beef. And so you're in this tiny little narrow spectrum if you're eating meat. Whereas if you eat a plant-based meal, so contrast a veggie taco that's got, all the complexity of a really greatly prepared vegetable taco compared to your typical taco that's mostly ground beef with a little bit of sour cream on top. It's night and day as far as the colors and the nutrients and the whole impact. Now, part of that impact is on you, but that's downstream. Primary impact of that colorful meal is actually on your microbiome. The more color you put on your plate, the more you're going to demand your microbiome to match that complexity, broaden out. So there's certain species that can deal with the nutrients in a beet, but there's others that have to be present if they're going to deal with the orange of a carrot. And so those colors are mimicking or reflecting these really unique nutrient profiles that are going to demand in and of themselves unique bacterial populations to deal with or metabolize or digest those components. So low on the food chain, as much color as possible. That's the short answer.
That's great. I love it. So as our big last question, I want to ask you about this connection between the bacteria we've been talking about and this idea of human consciousness. Tell us about that.
I plan to spend the rest of my career in this area. I just so love this topic. It has so transformed my understanding of human health. It turns out this glyphosate molecule that we've been talking about, which is Roundup, this chemical that we spray on all of our food and herbicide, pesticide, that thing, when it touches the gut lining, it causes leak. And this is not just the gut, it's also the blood vessels, the blood-brain barrier, the kidney tubules, everything starts to leak. You're literally losing the identity of outside world to inside world. And that's what's happening through our food right now is our children and ourselves as adults are starting to have a degradation of ourselves at the biologic level. We're losing self-identity at the cellular level. And I think that's being exactly mirrored in our macro behavior. As we lose communication, as our microbiome is destroyed by the antibiotics in our food chain, by the glyphosate, by the Roundup, and by the antibiotics that we get from our doctors, etc., as we lose all that communication, we get inflammation in the body.
And I want to pause you for 1 second because I just want to make sure listeners understand, as well as myself, because we hear this term like leaky gut, right? And it's like, what does that actually mean? What are you talking about? Because I'm visualizing like the bacteria in my gut's not staying in my gut, or it's going to other parts of my body in a bad way. Can you just like really break it down for us so we understand?
Yeah. So your gut lining covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. And that gut lining is composed of a single cell layer deep, which is about half the width of a human hair. So picture 2 tennis courts and cellophane that's as thick as half of a human hair, and now spread that cellophane over the 2 tennis courts, and that's your protection. That's what defines your identity at the cell level. Behind that is you. In front of that membrane is the outside world, and every bite of food and every sip of water, every breath you take is on the other side of that membrane. And so that tiny skinny membrane is what we are looking at. Glyphosate is probably the primary mechanism by which that thing starts to fall apart. And when I say fall apart, you got to realize that huge piece of cellophane is made up of trillions of tiny little cells that are now all tied together by something that looks like Velcro, these little Velcro-like proteins that are holding together trillions of cells to make this giant carpet across the 2 tennis courts. So now you have this carpet held together by Velcro. And the Roundup is damaging the Velcro such that everything that should have been outside now has the opportunity to sneak inside. You mentioned bacteria crossing, and that happens quite frequently, especially to our animals that are being exposed to a lot. So the number 1 killer in cows right now in feedlots is respiratory pneumonia that is from bacteria that's crossing their leaky gut into their bloodstream and finding the aerated environment of the lung and growing a pneumonia there. And so their second cause of death is liver abscess, which is, again, bacteria crossing the leaky gut and setting up shop in the liver and killing the cow that way. And so that's the example of kind of the severest version of leaky gut, because their Roundup levels are about somewhere around 100 times higher than ours typically.
So if this bacteria stays in our gut, it's healthy and it's good because we want that diversity and for there to be balance. But the minute it starts seeping into other parts of the body, it causes all these problems and potentially cancer. Is that right?
Yeah, cancer is like way down the road. Yeah, so bacteria ends up in the wrong spot, or bacteria represents in the wrong ratios, becomes a problem.
Okay, perfect. So I wanted to keep going now. I just wanted to make sure I understood and that listeners, like, we're all visualizing the same thing. So
But more importantly, before we move on from that, we should emphasize that it's not just bacteria that are crossing inappropriately. Much more commonly than that, food itself is crossing inappropriately. So all that kale, which has all that insoluble fiber, as it digests, that insoluble fiber is supposed to stay in your gut and pass with your stool. And if it does that, it has all kinds of anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer effects. But if you have a leaky membrane and that insoluble fiber crosses that membrane into your immune system, now it's its own problem. And kale just became your enemy. And so that's the problem with leaky gut, is suddenly everything that you breathe and eat has the opportunity to cause an immune response. So suddenly you're going to have seasonal allergies because you're breathing pollen that's crossing into your immune system. You're going to have food sensitivities, food allergies. You're going to have bloating. You're going to have irritable bowel, all this stuff because the permeable membrane is happening.
And that's sort of my next question, and sorry if it's a naive question, but it's like, is there a test for this? Like, is there a test to know if my gut is leaky or not, or it's only sort of something we figure out by all these other symptoms, like having IBS or having chronic illness of other kind?
There are clinical tests that we can do. We can actually give some large carbohydrate sugars that should not pass into the bloodstream. So we can give those orally, and then we can test them in the urine or in the blood and show that, yep, you've got a leaky gut, that those big carbohydrates are crossing unregulated into your bloodstream and you're peeing out. And so we can do that clinically, but it's a very rough measure. It shows only the most severe cases of leaky gut. The best way and there's some other labs that I won't go into that are more esoteric and more complicated. The short answer is you can tell if you have leaky gut if you have any sensitivity to your environment. So if you get a runny nose a couple times a year, if you from the seasonal allergy kind of effect, or if you have foods that you now realize you're sensitive to, or you have brain fog and some memory issues, or you have poor sleep quality or sex drive, your metabolism is slowing down. All of these things that we see happening across the population are symptoms of a declining function of that gut lining and that barrier between outside world and inside world. And this ties right back into what we were just starting into, which is consciousness. What we are seeing in our population, especially in our children, I believe, because they are the most affected, because we keep passing on less and less and less bacteria as we go, these children are losing sense of self-identity, and they are really reaching out in all kinds of unusual ways through social media and internet-based things and everything else to try to find some context of community, some sort of context to understand self. But they are so externalized in their self-perception, and I think a large reason of that is because they are so broken down at the gut lining and at the blood vessel lining, at the blood-brain barrier. They have so lost the sense of outside world to inside world. That loss of self-identity has led to a desperate level of major depression, anxiety, and just a sense of ungroundedness in our population. You don't have to look to the children. All of us, listening today are in one way or another really seeking a higher level of function. We're doing yoga, we're doing meditation, largely because we sense that we're not at peak performance right now as a population. And I think humanity is groaning and straining right now to reach a higher consciousness. And that is what's going to finally bump us over, where we're no longer looking to a supplement or, a doctor to even give us any information. Once we reach that higher resonance of consciousness, the stream will be individualized. Each of us will know exactly who we are and what our purpose is here. And there will be so much less of this burden of kind of loss of consciousness, loss of self-identity. But I think until we start to patch up these membranes, we're not going to see that big consciousness shift on the potential that it could. And the reason I've become so convinced of this is because of my experience in clinic over the last 5 years of using this supplement. In the first couple of weeks, I have people come back in overjoyed, often crying and hugging me. I haven't slept this well in years. All my achiness is this or that, or my brain fog finally lifted. I've been dealing with that for 3 decades. And all these crazy, wonderful biology stories happen in the first few weeks. But then that same woman comes back 18 months later and says, "Doc, guess what I did last week? I finally divorced my husband and left after 30 years of an abusive relationship." That woman put her gut membrane back together. The blood-brain barrier came back together. She's changed the way she was interacting with her environment as well. She started doing more hikes. In that process, she found self-identity to the point where she was drawing boundaries, not just at the cell level effectively. Suddenly this intact boundary between the outside world and your gut lining, that was intact. Well, with enough time of that boundary set up, there was a decrease in the general inflammation. There was a decrease in the static in her mind, the brain fog. She started to develop clarity on who she was, and she started to develop healthy emotional boundaries, healthy physical boundaries to say, I am not dealing with this physical or psychological abuse anymore. I'm getting myself out of this situation. That's my joy and excitement of that's what we've lost is our connection to the ecosystem. Mother Earth, in her complexity, in her beauty, in her diversity, has the real fabric of consciousness built into it. And if we can plug back into it, our self-identity comes into focus. And to watch this happen under a microscope, and then watch it happen in a patient, and then to watch it happen in my community, to watch this happen in my companies that I run, everybody in the companies is rising because they're more and more every day more clear about who they are at the cell level, and they're more and more clear about why they're here among us and why they've worked their whole lives to be in purpose right now. So that's the bizarre relationship between bacteria and their maintenance of our boundaries, and those boundaries roles in our ability to kind of reach this moment of self-awareness, self-identity, and move towards an opportunity of consciousness of why are we here? We are all here with great purpose.
So powerful what you're saying, and I love how you really are tying together the science at a cell level with what so many of us feel to be true, which is that, you know, we want to have that driving purpose in our lives, and we want to feel connected to something greater than ourselves while also having this really strong self-esteem and sense of boundaries and self-identity. So I can't thank you enough for talking with us today, sharing all your knowledge. If people want to get more connected with you, whether it's through some of the companies you run or the products you're developing, what's the best place for them to take a next step or go online to either find you or what you're working on?
Zach Bush, MD, ZachBushMD.com is a kind of a clearinghouse website to get you in touch with a lot of what we do, including a lot of our science. There's a big podcast that we're coming out with an amazing series looking at death and dying and transformation, rebirth, all kinds of really exciting stuff on that podcast coming out. So ZachBushMD.com is a good site for a lot of the diversity of what I do. And then if you want more about the supplement and the discussion around soil, all of our peer-reviewed journal articles are accessed through the Zach site, but also through the retail site, which is Restore, RESTORE, 4, life.com, restoreforlife.com. That'll get you to a lot of the science and blogs and everything else about soil and composting and breathing and all the fun stuff we've talked about today.
Thank you so much for being with us. I've enjoyed our conversation so much. I really appreciate your time. And listeners, this was a huge episode. I had a lot of mind-blowing epiphany moments listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So head on over to the Sivana East Facebook group and let us know. Or of course, we always love getting your feedback in the modality of a review here on iTunes. So let us know what you thought about the show and any upcoming guests or topics you'd like us to address next. I hope you have a beautiful, healthy, and happy day. Thanks so much for tuning in. From my heart to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Sivana Podcast. To find out more about Sivana, go to SivanaSpirit.com or follow Sivana on Facebook at Facebook.com/Sivana Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at SivanaEast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Sivana Podcast.